next piece that we're going to play is by John Cage. It's called Credo and Us. It was written in 1942. It's one of many works that John Cage wrote between 1935 and the early 40s. It's actually later in his compositional output for music, for percussion in that early sort of time period. You're going to see a lot of similarities in terms of instrumentation that was used. For instance, using tom-toms and cans and muted gongs. There's some other instruments that are more heavily involved in this piece, one being the piano, which I am playing. Not only just played normally, but also modified by muting some of the strings in real time. And then there's also both a radio and a phonograph that are involved. For the performance that we're doing, we're actually going to be using the iPhone, sort of a modified or an updated version of the phonograph to do this.
The piece was written, as Pete mentioned, in 1942, which, if you know your U.S. history, was very soon after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. So it was a time of sort of great upheaval, and the U.S. was entering World War II, and because of this, there was a lot of music being written at the time that was very patriotic and sort of almost like propaganda to get just sort of rallying the troops, because it was an important time for America. And this piece in many ways is Cage's reaction to that, because he wanted to write a piece, I think that he wanted to write a piece that reflected what he loved about America and what he sort of thought the American experience was like. So this piece in many ways is like a collage. You hear, the piece starts off with this phonograph, or iPhone in our case, playing a piece that is a classical music piece. He says any sort of big symphonic work, and he gives some examples of composers. We're using the last movement of Brahms' Third Symphony. So it's totally unexpected. And the only thing more unexpected than hearing at the beginning of a percussion piece a big symphonic work is that big symphonic work being interrupted by a bunch of tin cans and gongs. So you have this sort of noise sound, maybe indicative of just the noise of the 20th century. Cars passing by, horns honking, and the two sort of butt up against each other the whole piece.
Cage describes the piece as a suite with a satirical character, and you hear a lot of that satire. Well, one, obviously, in the pre-recorded material that's being used, as well as when we turn on the radio, for instance, you hear a lot of contemporary dialogue or music or whatever happens to be on the radio. And then there's two solos within the piece where it's just piano for a minute or so. And both of those pieces, well, one he describes as the first one is a cowboy song. And it's just a very simple melody using some modified piano techniques on it. And the second one he describes as more jazz or blues or pop music influenced. And again, when you see it, when you hear it, you'll understand where this satire is coming from. So it's definitely a commentary on contemporary society in 1942. you know.
So maybe if he was writing the piece today, instead of a cowboy song and a jazz song, it would be like a Lady Gaga tune,
Some other hip hop tune,
or something, you know, something like that. Because the point is that you're hearing the symphonic work, which has a real context. You hear that piece, and it makes you think, like, wow, orchestra in tuxedos on a stage with a conductor, and everybody's dressed up, and then tin cans and stuff, and all these trashy sounds come in. So you're like, I don't know what's going on, and then all of a sudden, you know, the pop song comes on, and that's. Again, that's a little bit of Cage saying this is what America is. We take some things from Europe. We have these junk sounds, but we also have our own sort of popular styles.
And he's poking fun at just a variety of different elements. I mean, obviously the classical music. I mean, he was a classical composer, you know, but and he's sort of taking a stab at your traditional classical concert experience by opening it up. Like the beginning of this piece is just a symphonic work that actually nobody is playing, you know, and then all of a sudden it just jumps straight into weird, you know, sounds, groovy material. So it was obviously very progressive for its time, still resonates well even today, still feels fresh and vital.
We've played it for audiences who've really just been cracking up.
Yeah.
Because in the middle, as you'll see, there's a bit where the piano plays these really violent chords, these kind of noisy chords, and it alternates with the radio. And Clay plays the radio, and he just turns it on, and as you can imagine, we have no idea what's going to happen. And it's different every single performance. And sometimes actually it's very poignant because, you know, sometimes maybe the radio's tuned to NPR and you're hearing about current events, and in the middle of a concert you're hearing about some terrible violent event that's happened in the world. Or maybe it's some silly talk radio show.
Or it's a Jimi Hendrix solo
or
something.
Yeah.
You never really know. And you know, we've toured with this all around the country, and sometimes it becomes regional if you have a local, you know, public radio station and is talking about, you know, current events right in that town, you know.
The pizza scene out on 3. Reaching that point, don't get too excited though. The pizza box.
Right in it, and actually, we know of some to meet new people. They started Odyssey clubs. Adventures in Odyssey would be the kind of kids we want to hang out with here in California.
Another really important part of this piece is that it was written for choreography. So during this period of Cage's life, and really throughout his life, he was heavily involved in writing music for dancers, for choreographers. And this piece was written to accompany dance that was choreographed by Merce Cunningham, with whom Cage worked for his entire life, and another great dancer choreographer, Gene Erdman. And there are, you'll notice, a number of silences in the piece where the whole ensemble stops for a moment. And originally, when the piece was performed with choreography, there was a spoken text during those silences that Merce Cunningham, the dancer and choreographer, was speaking. But now, as a concert piece, you just leave those as silences, which is maybe appropriate in a way because this piece was written 10 years before Cage's most famous piece, 4 minutes and 33 seconds. But it's interesting in a way. 4 minutes and 33 seconds is a piece that is for solo performer tacit, which means you don't play, which of course means that there's no performed sound. And that may seem odd. It certainly seemed odd to the people who went to the first performance of it. But the point that Cage was trying to make was that there are so many amazing sounds around us all the time. So even if you go to a performance of that and what you're hearing is people sort of shuffling in their seats or the air conditioning or traffic passing by outside, each of those sounds is amazing. And a piece like 4 minutes and 33 seconds sort of opens up your ears to that. And in an interesting way, this piece, Credo and Us, written 10 years earlier, gives us many moments of silence to also sort of hear what's going on around us that's not the performed sound. in terms of playing the piece, like as a percussion piece, some of the challenges are, first of all, the piano part, which luckily Pete is a fine pianist, in addition to being an amazing percussionist, so he can actually handle it. None of the rest of us were up to that challenge. The percussion parts, which more traditional, let's call them percussion parts, that Rob and I are playing, the challenge is the polyrhythms, which are sort of all over, again, John Cage's percussion music that he's writing at this time. So for instance, I'll be playing 5 notes spaced evenly in a bar, a quintuplet, while Rob is playing 6 notes spaced evenly a bar, 2 triplets in a row. And we have to sort of both play those nice and even and then land together on a downbeat. And that's just one example, but it sort of happens throughout the piece. And it's what creates this sort of chaotic feel sometimes.
There's a dissonance that's always created by these like polyrhythms, but it was another way that Cage, in all of his music, was trying to more identify like the counterpoint in the lines themselves, like rather than just have everybody in the same type of meter or in the same type of subdivision, having multiple subdivisions going along at the same time, and then your ear, along with like the timbre that you're hearing of the different instruments, and your ear can, point towards this one figure or this one line as well as this other line, and hear them sort of interweaving together. And it's one of those things where, I mean, the rhythms that he uses, the instruments that he uses, together combined, I mean, you can instantly recognize a Cage piece from that time period, It's set in stone. Yeah.
And Cage was much more interested in rhythm and in the sounds, the timbres of the instruments, than he was in harmony. As a matter of fact, he sort of turned his back on harmony very intentionally. It was just something that didn't interest him. And at this time in particular of his life, he did a lot of writing, and we know that he basically said that in his view, the future of music, harmony would not be as important, and writing for percussion music would sort of open the door to eventually an electronic music where any sound was possible. And the interest is created by the sound and by the rhythms, and not by the harmony, which had been sort of the cornerstone of classical music leading up to the point when Cage was writing music.
Cage was taking a lot of concepts that were part of the futurist movement in the early 20th century, and other composers were interested in this that eventually influenced John Cage, like Varese and his ionization, the first major work for percussion, was a big, huge influence on John Cage. And yeah, the idea that noise can be the basis for music, noise and the rhythm, and just sort of disregarding all, a couple hundred years before that of melody and harmony. Again, just very, very radical for the time, and something that's just still very, very vibrant and very exciting even today to play.
Another interesting thing about this piece, and again, all of the percussion music that Cage was writing at this time, is that he was performing it. So Cage premiered this piece. He played your part, I think, right?
Yep.
Piano part.
Yep.
So whether you're thinking about Credo and Us, this piece that we're about to play, or Third Construction, Second Construction, First Construction, all of these pieces that he was writing at this time, he was performing, his wife was performing, and he would sort of just ask friends, colleagues where he was teaching to perform these pieces. So interestingly enough, they weren't actually initially pieces that were performed by trained percussionists. Yeah. At the time, there was no such thing as percussion ensemble. It just didn't exist. You couldn't go to school to study percussion ensemble music. it didn't exist.
It wasn't there.
Cage liked to say that, I mean, when he first started working with this group, there were like 3 or 4 pieces, really,
Yeah.
of classical music for percussion, and he was actually largely responsible for building the first repertoire for our ensemble. You know, within a span of a few years, 50, 100 pieces had been written.
Yeah.
That were for percussion ensemble, because he took the initiative to start a group and say, I think this music is important, I'm going to put on concerts, I'm going to tour this music, I'm going to write some myself, I'm going to write to other composers that I appreciate and ask them to write music for it.
Even some of like the other very well-known historical pieces like Chavez's Toccata was a piece that was commissioned by John Cage and his ensemble. You know, so not only was he writing music that was incredibly influential and would influence, you know, the rest of the century of percussion music, but he was also active in the commissioning process as well. And then he had his own group that was touring around the country. You know, we would be in a very different place without John Cage, for sure.